Hey there, amazing friends. I warmly invite you to join me on this exciting journey by subscribing to my channel, liking, commenting, and sharing my videos. Every like, comment, and share brings us closer together and fuels my passion to create more great content. Your support truly makes all the difference. Thank you for being the heart of this community. Jack Unterweger, the serial killer journalist, murders across European cities. Midnight blanketed the narrow streets of Vienna when a police patrol discovered the strangled body of a woman near a winding canal. It was the early 1990s, and fear had begun creeping into certain dark corners of the city. At first, few suspected that her demise was anything more than an isolated tragedy, violent but random. Yet, as the weeks passed and new victims emerged under disturbingly similar circumstances, alarm bells rang. Austria faced the prospect of a serial killer lurking among its picturesque avenues, preying upon individuals with a chilling, methodical pattern. Little did anyone suspect that the culprit might be a man often seen in the spotlight, not as a suspect, but as a journalist covering crime stories. His name was Jack Unterweger, a figure whose very existence seemed to blur the line between cunning manipulation and raw brutality, and whose spree of murders would eventually span several European cities. The path that led him from a difficult childhood to the gallows of criminal infamy highlights a unique blend of intellect, media savvy, and a deep-seated compulsion to kill, a combination that rendered him one of the most disturbing criminals of his era. By the time investigators pieced together the twisted puzzle, Jack Unterweger's face had already graced talk shows, public events, and literary circles. He had become a minor celebrity as a reformed offender turned successful journalist, an ostensible triumph of rehabilitation. In fact, it was this veneer of success and self-transformation that allowed him to infiltrate the corridors of media, forging contacts with influential figures. All the while, behind the scenes, he embarked on a spree of homicides that spread from Austria to the Czech Republic and even across the Atlantic in the United States. Understanding how this murderer managed to lead such a double life requires stepping back to examine his childhood traumas, his first conviction, and the bizarre path that allowed him to posture as an emblem of prison rehabilitation, only to reveal the darkest corners of his psyche. Troubled origins and first killing. Jack Unterweger was born on August 16, 1950, in Judenburg, Austria. His childhood was shaped by instability and neglect. His mother was a barmaid who had relationships with American soldiers stationed in post-war Austria. Jack was thus half American, half Austrian, yet his father never played any real role in his life. Abandoned by his mother, Jack spent much of his childhood under the care of his abusive grandfather, an alcoholic whose brutality shaped the boy's earliest experiences of violence. From a tender age, Jack drifted through a life shaped by theft, petty crime, and a sense of deep-rooted resentment. Documents from social services and juvenile institutions paint a picture of a youth who exuded cunning, unpredictability, and a desire for control. He engaged in a variety of minor crimes, with patterns of aggression surfacing often, particularly aggression toward women. At 24, Unterweger escalated to homicide. In 1974, he was arrested for the murder of a young German woman named Margaret Schaefer. Her body, discovered in a woodland area, bore evidence of a vicious beating and strangulation with her bra, a trademark that would eerily repeat in later murders. The crime was brutal, leaving authorities shaken at the level of violence. Unterweger confessed to the killing, but claimed it was a moment of madness. The court disagreed, sentencing him to life in prison. For many criminals, that might have been the end of their story, a slow fade into the anonymity of a cell. But for Unterweger, prison marked only the start of something more complicated. 2. Life behind bars and the birth of a literary star. During his incarceration, Unterweger began writing. Books, plays, poems, some featured confessional themes, focusing on his remorse and a desire for redemption. Austrian literary circles took note his writing garnered reviews that praised its raw authenticity and emotional honesty. Over time, he developed a reputation for introspection, leading some intellectuals to champion him as a symbol of the rehabilitative power of art. The media, always starved for a sensational redemption story, latched onto the narrative of a savage murderer turned soulful writer seeking absolution. The more his reputation for redemption through literature soared, the more support he gained from influential quarters, including prominent authors and politicians. They claimed that he had transformed himself from a petty and violent youth into a penitent adult who understood the depths of wrongdoing. By the 1980s, calls for Unterweger's early release became more frequent. His supporters argued that his literary achievements showed he had undergone genuine reform. They contended that continuing to keep him behind bars served no purpose. Among his backers were some of Austria's leading cultural figures who petitioned relentlessly on his behalf. The campaign eventually succeeded, and in 1990, after serving about 15 years in prison, Jack Unterweger was paroled. It was a remarkable outcome. A convicted murderer freed largely because the public believed in his reformation. Many greeted him as a minor celebrity, eager to see him continue writing and offer insights on the criminal mind. The press, too, welcomed him. Soon, he was giving interviews, signing books, even featured on talk shows to discuss the journey from violence to artistic redemption. All the while, the seeds for a more monstrous saga were quietly taking root. 3. Re-emergence into society and double life upon release, Unterweger was propelled into a new chapter. He initially embraced the media attention with apparent humility. He gave motivational talks about his transformation, cautioning youths against the path of violence, urging them to find purpose in creativity. Privately, though, his personal life mirrored old patterns of aggression. Rumors circulated among acquaintances that he displayed controlling or manipulative behavior, particularly around women. Some found him oddly charismatic, yet undeniably unsettling. But the broader public saw only the gracious, reformed man with a captivating life story, from prison cell to respected writer. Surrounded by journalists, he gained assignments to cover crime stories for various Austrian publications. Ironic or not, he soon specialized in reporting about murders or prostitutes, offering a perspective that readers found intriguingly raw. In TV segments, he strolled through red light districts, microphone in hand, discussing the world's oldest profession with apparent empathy or dissecting ongoing police investigations. Yet behind the scenes, murders began to reoccur in Vienna. Several women, predominantly sex workers, were discovered strangled with their breasts, each body left in deserted areas. The striking resemblance in modus operandi to the 1974 killing gave rise to a sense of primal fear. However, police were slow to suspect Unterweger. After all, he was in the limelight, operating as a journalist, and presumably reformed. In fact, some of his new articles criticized the police for failing to protect these women or for incompetence in solving the crimes. The irony was staggering, but it worked to deflect suspicion. He cultivated an image of a journalist shining a harsh light on institutional failures. Meanwhile, more women vanished in a spree that extended beyond Austria's borders. 4. Expansion of crime across Europe. A savvy manipulator, Unterweger traveled to other European countries under the guise of investigating prostitution and its social ramifications. He visited the Czech Republic, Switzerland, and Germany, each time filing stories about red light districts, the plight of vulnerable women, and the challenges of law enforcement. In these locations, a pattern of murders started to appear, again, mostly sex workers, strangled with their own breasts, bodies hidden in underpasses or secluded lots. Local police forces often had no reason to suspect this Austrian journalist passing through. He was polite, well-spoken, and in some circles revered as an example of successful rehabilitation. Only gradually did cross-border chatter among officers reveal a consistent killer's signature. Under normal circumstances, it might be difficult to link these murders across international boundaries. But the bra strangulation technique was so distinctive, reminiscent of the method used in the 1974 crime, that it eventually sparked an epiphany among certain investigators. Within Austria, a detective named Ernst Otto Krenlinger started noticing unusual coincidences. Each city that Unterweger visited for his journalistic work soon afterwards reported a prostitute's body discovered under eerily similar circumstances. The policeman, lacking direct evidence, remained quiet at first, uncertain if he risked accusing a near celebrity of monstrous acts. But the pattern refused to vanish. Eventually, he confided in a small circle of colleagues. They pored over flight records, receipts, and the timeline of murders. The alignment was chilling. By cross-referencing hotel bookings and Unterweger's known travel itinerary with the murder dates, they saw that he was almost always in the vicinity. The idea that the beloved, redeemed writer was orchestrating a transnational murder spree seemed both shocking and horrifyingly plausible. The American Detour. Murders in Los Angeles amid intensifying rumors of suspicion. Unterweger traveled to Los Angeles in mid-1991. Publicly, he was there to research American attitudes towards prostitution and crime for a European magazine. LA had been reeling from a wave of violent incidents, and so a foreign perspective on these issues was welcomed by some. He even accompanied LAPD night patrols, shadowing the officers and scribbling notes about the city's red light zones. The arrangement seemed to confirm his role as a fearless journalist. Yet soon after his arrival, multiple women vanished again. Sex workers, later discovered strangled with the same hallmark, their breasts used as ligatures. This time, the murders triggered alarm in the LAPD, who recognized the method's resonance with certain European cases. Enter the global law enforcement puzzle. Interpol's data, Austrian police suspicions, and LI's new murder spree all pointed to Jack Unterweger as a prime suspect. The realization that a traveling journalist might also be an international serial killer forced a synergy among police forces rarely seen in that era. The manhunt was on 6. From hunter to hunted, the global manhunt, once Austrian, law enforcement obtained enough probable cause. A warrant for Unterweger's arrest was issued. But the cunning killer sensed the net closing. He vanished from LA abruptly and began a fugitive odyssey across Europe, leaving cryptic letters for acquaintances and phone messages proclaiming his innocence. He insisted that prejudice against his criminal past led police to scapegoat him. Meanwhile, Interpol flagged him internationally. The press, which once championed his redemption story, found themselves in a moral quagmire, forced to reckon with the possibility that they had inadvertently shielded a remorseless murderer. The sensational coverage soared. Tabloids and mainstream outlets alike splashed his face on front pages, an intellectual figure, well-dressed, widely read, now implicated in savage murders across continents. His flight eventually ended in February 1992, when police tracked him down in Miami, Florida. The arrest was largely peaceful, though tense. Under interrogation, he maintained his innocence, claiming that the murders were orchestrated by someone eager to frame him. Some supporters clung to the idea that he was indeed framed, citing alleged holes in the timeline or the lack of direct forensic evidence. But investigators compiled witness statements, travel logs, and eventually some forensic links, fibers, partial DNA traces on victims that could not fully exonerate him. The bra ligature technique alone might not have sufficed in a court of law, but combined with the mounting circumstantial evidence, it formed a powerful case. He was extradited to Austria to face trial. 7. Trial and unmasking the monster in Austria. The public was transfixed by the trial of Jack Unterweger, the once celebrated model of rehabilitation turned prime suspect for multiple murders. The prosecution argued that from his release in 1990 to 1992, he had systematically exploited his journalist persona to approach vulnerable women under the guise of interviews, only to lure them to isolated spots. He would then strangle them with their own brass in a twisted echo of his original 1974 crime. The prosecution presented travel records meticulously matching crime scenes, witness testimony from neighbors who recalled seeing him near victims' homes, and the chilling parallel of each murder's signature. Forensic evidence was partial due to the ephemeral nature of many crime scenes, but the pattern was overwhelming. As for the accused, his defense was as cunning as he was. He insisted on innocence, claiming he was being persecuted because of his prior murder conviction and the social prejudice that a reformed ex-convict cannot truly be rehabilitated. He recited reams of poetry and spiritual reflection to argue that he was incapable of such monstrous acts. Yet the court saw through the performance. The testimonies from police across Austria, the Czech Republic, and the US hammered home the correlation between his presence and the rash of killings. Ultimately, the jury found him guilty of 9 murders, though the tally might have been higher. The conviction, achieved in June 1994, signaled the end of a saga that had enthralled and horrified the public. The serial killer journalist was sentenced to life imprisonment once more, never to taste the illusions of freedom he had exploited so effectively. 8. The dark mindset and psychological speculation. Why would an apparently intelligent, articulate individual who had once commanded the sympathies of an entire nation revert to such brutality? Psychologists studying Unterweger's story surmise that his violent impulses were likely deep-rooted, fueled by an abusive childhood and a pathological fixation on controlling or dominating women, particularly those on the social margins, like sex workers, who lacked strong protective networks. His capacity for manipulation was extraordinary. He had dazzled the public with literary talent, harnessed the media's appetite for redemption arcs, and even gained the ear of influential elites. Perhaps the very success of this facade emboldened his darker side. The murders, some reason, were not just physical violence, but symbolic reassertions of power. Each bra strangulation might have been a macabre calling card, reminding the world that no matter how society tried to reform him, the killer within remained unstoppable. In interviews after his conviction, Unterweger vacillated between claiming innocence and offering cryptic nods to being misunderstood. He refused to explicitly confess. Some interpret that as pure psychopathy, a refusal to take accountability. Others point out that full confession would sabotage any residual hope for an appeal. Regardless, his persona remained defiant, lacking remorse or empathy for the victims and their loved ones. The stark contrast between his articulate public persona and the sadistic nature of his crimes underscores a chilling capacity for compartmentalization that experts often associate with high-functioning sociopaths. IX. Death and the lingering questions. The story ended abruptly in June 1994, the very night he received his life sentence. Jack Unterweger was found dead in his prison cell, having hanged himself with a rope fashioned from shoelaces or a belt. The final act stunned both supporters who believed in his innocence and the outraged families of victims who hoped to see him face decades behind bars. Some labeled it the ultimate admission of guilt, while conspiracy-minded individuals speculated about potential murder orchestrated by unknown conspirators. But the official conclusion was suicide. In a final cruel twist, Unterweger's demise left many unanswered questions. Were there other murders beyond the ones attributed to him? Had he acted alone? Did any collaborator or accomplice help him evade detection across different countries? Those inquiries remain swirling in the realm of speculation, overshadowed by the abrupt exit of their central figure. Media coverage of his suicide fueled a mixture of relief, no more victims at his hands, and frustration that he evaded truly serving out a life term. Over time, the public's fascination with the case receded, overshadowed by new headlines and tragedies. Yet criminologists frequently cite the Unterweger saga as a prime example of how society's hunger for redemption stories can backfire, inadvertently empowering manipulative offenders. The notion that a convicted murderer could re-enter society as a celebrated journalist only to commit the same savage acts on a broader, more cunning scale is a testament to the lethal synergy between cunning and gullibility. A tale that echoes on today. The memory of Jack Unterweger persists among true crime enthusiasts and in criminology lectures, examining the complexities of recidivism, media complicity, and serial murderer psychology. The chilling details that he used his freedom to kill in multiple countries, that he interviewed police investigating murders he himself committed, that he leveraged his role as an ex-convict turned star writer to allay suspicion, remain deeply unsettling. Many view the fiasco as a cautionary tale about the perils of naive faith in an offender's self-proclaimed transformation. Others stress that the real tragedy lies in the lost lives of his victims, largely marginalized or overlooked individuals who deserved protection but instead became pawns in his twisted quest for dominance. An uneasy aura still hangs over the cityscapes he haunted. In some neighborhoods, older residents recall the tension of those years, the whispered fear that a murderer walked among them disguised as a champion of prison reform. Others recall the bizarre spectacle of his interviews, how he seemed relaxed and glib discussing the murders, all the while chasing leads that turned out to be his own trail. The historical record likewise documents the fateful synergy of incompetent or naive officials who initially embraced him as a shining example. If the detective Ernst Otto Krenlinger hadn't connected the dots, who knows how long Unterweger might have continued, emboldened by the lack of suspicion. Even in Los Angeles, a place accustomed to violent crime and tabloid mysteries, the brief period of Jack Unterweger's presence is remembered in certain corners of law enforcement lore. That a foreign national could embed himself as a reporter on ride-alongs, quietly selecting targets from among the city's most vulnerable, underscores the baffling success of his facade. The abrupt cessation of the LA strangulations once he fled confirms how close-lipped some communities can be about their nocturnal horrors. Indeed, after the 1992 revelations, more questions emerged. Did he commit murders in other American cities he traveled through undiscovered? The evidence remains inconclusive. In the final accounting, Jack Unterweger's tale exemplifies the darkest extremes of a cunning murderer's capacity to weaponize public sympathy and exploit vulnerabilities in systems. He committed at least 11 confirmed murders, some suspect more, across multiple countries under the guise of professional curiosity, all while championing himself as a crusader against crime. That contradiction alone cements his place in the grim pantheon of serial killers whose stories read more like twisted fiction than reality. The vantage of an ex-convict turned journalist privy to inside information from both criminals and law enforcement gave him an advantage that few criminals possess. He manipulated that vantage mercilessly, striking repeatedly in a pattern that paid homage to his original crime. The final outcome, his suicide, prevents us from ever fully dissecting his motivations or mapping the entire scope of his spree. In the silence left by his death, the victims' stories deserve the final emphasis. Indeed, each of the women he murdered had a life, a set of hopes, or perhaps daily struggles, but all found themselves in the path of a man who saw them as disposable. Their tragedies remain the abiding sorrow behind every line of text analyzing his cunning. In sum, Jack Unterweger, the serial killer journalist, murders across European cities stands as an unsettling reminder that real life can produce sagas far more terrifying than anything contrived by fiction. Here was a man who emerged from prison with a facade of redemption, capturing the hearts and minds of intellectual circles, only to revert to ruthless homicide while mocking law enforcement from inside the press corps. Although he ultimately paid with his own life in a manner that sidestepped decades behind bars, the damage inflicted cannot be undone. The memory of his cunning and the ephemeral hope that he might have truly changed remains a bitter lesson. Even now, decades later, his tale exemplifies the precarious line between trust and deception, underscoring how the thirst for a good redemption narrative can blind the best-intentioned communities. And in the haunted afterthought, we are reminded that some seeds of darkness take root so deeply that no amount of external cultivation can truly eradicate them.